We're continuing our series in Galatians. I told you whenever I was first preparing for this, I thought, 6 chapters, 6 weeks. Welcome to week 11. And we're not done. This is week 11. Last week, we ended in Galatians chapter 5, verse 25, and here's what it says. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. So Paul says, keep in step with the Spirit, walking every day with the Spirit in prayer and in Bible study, so that we will not be led, and then he says in verse 26, let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. It says, if you walk by the Spirit, you will not be led off into a life of conceit. What he really means is self-centeredness. Like, it's all about me. Self-absorbed. And because he says, because what happens is that causes us to provoke each other. See, Jesus called us to make disciples for him, and we can't do that if I'm self-centered and self-absorbed, because I wind up provoking each other. Or we wind up provoking each other. Back in verse 14 of chapter 5, it says, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. He said, if you love God with all of your heart, and if you love your neighbor as yourself, the whole law, the whole Old Testament is summed up in that. And then Jesus said, and if you will just love your neighbor as yourself from your heart, that's all I'm asking you to do. But you can't do that if it's all about me. If everything is about me and what I want, what I desire, you cannot do the only thing that Jesus told us to do. He only told us to do one thing while he was gone. Go and make disciples. And you cannot do that if it's all about me. We looked briefly last week at verse 22 and 23 of chapter 5, where it talks about the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, which means mercy, basically. Love, joy, peace, forbearance, mercy, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. If you walk by the Spirit, and that word fruit is a singular word. It is not plural. Okay? He's not saying, listen, if you walk with the Spirit, listen, you're going to have some love, but you may not have peace. Or you may have joy, but you're not going to have any self-control. Right? It's all of them. It's one fruit. If you walk by the Spirit, you will have that fruit. You know what the opposite of those are? Because if you walk in the flesh, you're going to have the opposite of that. Put that chart up. That's the opposite. The opposite of love is hatefulness. The opposite of joy is despair. The opposite of peace, anxiety. The opposite of patience, impatience. Kindness is rudeness, goodness, evil thoughts. Faithfulness is unreliability. Gentleness is being abrasive or harsh. Self-control is being undisciplined. So take a hard look at that chart. Which one looks more like you? Yeah, maybe you have a little bit on each side. But Paul says, singular, if you walk by the Spirit, you will have the fruit of the Spirit. And so if we don't have the fruit of the Spirit, then maybe we're being a little self-centered. And Paul says, don't provoke others, because Jesus called us to make disciples. We've talked a lot about John 10:10 over the past year or so. Satan came only to steal, kill, and destroy. Everything that is on the left-hand side of that chart, Satan wants to kill it, steal it, and destroy it. But everything on the right is what happens when I'm focused on me, when I make it all about me. Which one do I want more of? Do I want to be more unreliable and rude? No. Nobody wants that. We want the ones on the other side. Why? Because it makes me feel better about myself? Because it makes me a happier person? Here's what I want you to get. Nothing on that list of the fruit of the Spirit is about you. Not one thing on that list is you. Everything on that list on the right, the fruit of the flesh, is about you. A tree does not eat its own fruit. An apple tree does not eat an apple to survive or to grow or to nourish itself. It nourishes itself on sunshine and on water, but not on the fruit that it bears. The fruit that you bear in the fruit of the Spirit is not for you. It is for anybody that comes in contact with you, for them to be nourished. So, are we nourishing the people around us? Or are we full of the fruit of the flesh? The first line in Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life, says this: it's not about you. Whenever I first read that book, that cracked me up. It's like, who starts a book out like that? Who? What publisher? Henry's not even here today, but what publisher would take this book and go, okay, opening line, it's not about you. Whoa, whoa, whoa. You're not going to sell any books saying that it's not about you, because, listen, we're princesses, right? We all want our tiara. Look at me, I'm a princess. It's about me. Everything is about me. It's what I want. It's what I desire. You can't sell a book. Other than the Bible, probably, my guess is one of the best-selling books of all times. Because we need to hear it. And Paul wasn't pulling no punches. He's like, hey, listen, princess, it ain't about you. It never has been about you. The fruit of the Spirit is not for you to eat. It is for you to bear so that others can be fed. So Paul says, since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. And then he goes on in chapter 6 to give us a hypothetical situation. Galatians 6:1 says this: so brothers and sisters, he's talking to the church. So brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. Paul says, hypothetically, let's just say somebody is caught in a sin. Now, what does he mean by that? Is that like a gotcha? Is that like, oh, did you hear what Agnes did? I caught her. See, that's not what Paul's saying. When Paul says, when somebody, hypothetically, is caught in a sin, it's not that you caught them. And now I got you. That's not what it means. It means to be caught by a sin. It means that it's almost like you let your guard down for a second and the sin caught up with you. And that happens to all of us. The Pharisees caught a woman in sin. They caught her in adultery. And then they came to Jesus, and this story is in John chapter 8, verse 3. Here's what it says: the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman who was caught in adultery. And they made her stand before the group, and they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught." In other words, we caught her in the act of adultery. Now, how did they catch her? It almost had to be like a sting operation. They had to have known something was going on, and they had to have been like just waiting to just pounce. Like, aha, gotcha. That's not fruit of the Spirit. They had to have known that something was going on. And since they were not bringing the man before the group to be stoned to death, there's a lot of scholars that believe that the man happened to be one of them. Like maybe it was a setup. Which would make sense if you look at what's about to take place in the rest of the verses. Verse 5 says, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say? Technically, that's not what the law said. They're like, aha, we caught her in a sin. And then they test Jesus to see if he would uphold the law of Moses. They wanted Jesus to be the one to cast that first stone and to condemn her for her act that they had caught her in. What the law actually said was that the man and the woman are to be stoned. I mean, don't let a little thing like what the Bible actually says get in the way of your self-righteousness, right? John Piper said, legalists don't need facts and proof. They only need suspicions and rumors. Their self-righteous imaginations will do all the rest. Back to verse 1, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, then he says, you who live by the Spirit, you're walking with the Spirit, not in the flesh. You who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. Is that what they were doing? Not gently if you're going to throw rocks at her. That's living by the flesh. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. The word for caught does not mean someone who is living in a lifestyle of sin, who's living in open rebellion. The word is pralambano. And according to Vine's Bible Dictionary, here's what it means. It does not mean detecting that you have detected a person in the act of a sin, but that somebody has been caught by a trespass through his being off his guard. There's a big difference. When Paul says, listen, hypothetically, if you catch somebody in a sin, that's not what he said. He said, listen, hypothetically, if somebody stumbled and messed up, how are you supposed to treat them? Do you throw stones at them because of your self-righteousness? How do you treat somebody who messed up? We all mess up. We will all be off our guard sometimes, and we will all get caught by sin sometimes. The question is, how are you going to treat the other person when it happens to them? Because Jesus says you're to treat them the way that you want them to treat you when you mess up. The same way that Jesus treated you. You know, when they brought this woman who they had caught in the act of adultery, the story goes on and it says, Jesus knelt down and he began to write with his finger in the sand. And everybody wants to know, what did he write? I think I know. I know for me what I think it is. Because I think when they're being self-righteous, and they're like, aha, we caught her in a sin. Jesus, I think, my personal opinion, I think he knelt down and he said, okay, Johnny, let me write out in the sand the one sin that you have in your life that you don't want nobody to know about. I think for you, maybe he knelt down and he wrote that one thing that you are so ashamed of in your life and in your past that you don't want none of us to know about. What if that's what he wrote down? Aha, I caught her. And Jesus is like, oh, did you? Because I know what you did. And I want you to treat her the same way I treated you when I found out what you did. That's the difference. We're all going to be caught by a sin because we're not perfect. We're walking in this world and we're going to get our feet dirty. How are you going to treat the other person who messed up? Look at what Jesus did when he found out about what I did and what you did. On his last night before Jesus was arrested, not only did he institute the Lord's Supper, which we're going to partake in a little while, he did something else that night. On the night that he was arrested, he washed the disciples' feet. See, this is all part of the Seder meal, the Passover meal, right? So the Passover meal, we've talked about this a lot, but the Passover meal had different stages to it. You know, you take a cup of wine and you say this blessing, you do this kind of thing. And when Jesus got to that part, he said, no, listen, this is about me. It's not about you. This is about me. This is symbolic of my blood that I shed. And then later on, he took the bread and he said, listen, this is symbolic of me. This is my body that is going to be broken in a few hours for you. Do this in remembrance of me. But in the middle of all of that, there was another part of that meal. There's another ceremony that they just do and they don't even know why. And it's the ceremonial washing of the hands. And so part of it is the lowest person, the lowest ranking person there, the slave or the lowest servant, whoever's the lowest person present, it is their job at this point in the ceremony to take a bowl of water and to go around and ceremonially wash everybody's hands. And then you hand them a towel and they dry their hands off and you move on with the meal. And Jesus did something different because what happened was right in the middle of all of this beautiful symbolic gesture that Jesus is doing, do you know what the disciples were doing? They began to argue over who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. It's all about me. Jesus said, this is my blood I'm about to shed for you instead of you. This is my body that's going to be broken instead of you. Hey, which one of us is going to have the seat at the right hand of God when we get to heaven? Which one of us is a better? Who's more righteous, me or you? And they're having this argument in front of Jesus moments before he's going to die for us. And so instead of washing hands, and he obviously was not the lowest ranking person there, but he said, no, I'm going to show y'all something. I'm going to teach you a lesson. Instead of washing hands, he took off his outer garment and he wrapped a towel around his waist. And he took the position of the lowest person there. And he got on his hands and his knees. And he didn't wash their hands. He washed their nasty feet. He washed their feet. And Peter said, you're not washing my feet. And he said, if I don't do this, you don't have no part of me because I've washed your body. You're clean, but you're still living in this world. You're still getting dirty. And every day he gets down and he washes your nasty feet because you still mess up. I still mess up. The question is, how am I going to treat you when you mess up? Am I going to treat you the same way that Jesus treated me? Or am I just going to throw rocks at you? Jesus said in John 13, verse 14, now that I, your Lord and your teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Do you know whose feet he washed? He washed the disciples' feet, but he also washed Judas' feet. Think about that. He already knew ahead of time what Judas was going to do. And he knelt down and he washed his nasty feet anyway. Yeah, but you don't know what that person did to me. You don't know what they did to me. Jesus knew what Judas had done and he washed his feet anyway. What are you going to do to the person that you caught in a sin? How do you treat somebody? You treat them the way that Jesus did, with the fruit of the Spirit, or with self-righteousness, like, well, that could never happen to me. Back to Galatians 6:1. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, You who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. And then in verse 2 he says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. In this way, by carrying each other's burdens, that's how you fulfill the law of Christ. Love God with all of your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. Carry each other's burdens. That's the difference. Are you trying to lift someone up and support them, or are you trying to tear them down? There's a guy by the name of John Miller. He said that the army of God, the church, the army of God, we're the only army that shoots its own wounded. When we have a fellow believer that has messed up, what is our first thought? Is it to shun them and to talk about them, or to lift them up? Paul says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. You don't lead people closer to God through catching them in a sin and throwing them under the bus. And you don't do it through hatefulness and impatience and rudeness and abrasiveness and harshness and everything else on that other side of the list. That's about you. Don't let Satan use me and you to be the one who kills somebody else's faith in Christ who happen to be caught by sin. You know, there's so many people that I've talked to that they don't want nothing to do with church because somebody in a church hurt them so badly. Do you realize it was the church people who hurt Jesus and crucified him? Listen, we will let you down. I personally will let you down. If I have not let you down yet, give me time. Be patient with me. I will get around to you. But I'm not the one that you need to put your faith in. And this church is not the one that you need to put your faith in. Listen, Jesus said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Period. Ever. Do you know how he could possibly say that and mean it? He's the only person in the history of the universe ever to be forsaken by God. Ever. If he had not been forsaken by God, he couldn't have died because he is God. God had to literally forsake him. He cried on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's the only person ever to be forsaken by God. And because of that, he can say to you with full assurance, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Johnny will. This church will. And if you have ever been hurt by somebody in the church, I am so sorry. But don't put your faith in us. Put your faith in Jesus Christ. Amen. Period. There's people who are just going through the motions in church. And sometimes they can appear to be the most righteous. But Jesus said they're whitewashed tombs. It's all on the exterior. They're full of dead men's bones. I've told y'all this a bunch of times, but I'm going to tell it again. Jesus told the parable of the sheep and the goats, and I just think it's a perfect illustration of this. When he told the parable of the sheep and the goats, we think, oh, church people, heathens. But that's not what he was talking about. I talked to a Jewish rabbi who was from Israel, and he explained it in such a beautiful way. He said, no, people don't get this parable. Jesus is not saying, I'm going to separate the church people from the heathens. One goes on the right and one goes on the left. That's not what he was saying. The literal translation is the indeed sheep. I'm going to separate the indeed sheep, the real sheep, from the kids or the baby goats. That's the literal translation. He said, we lose it in America because we don't raise them like they do in Israel, or like they did, especially back in Jesus' day. Because back in the day, what they did is they had a huge field, and they would turn all the goats and all the sheep out together. But at the end of the day, they would separate them out, the sheep into one pen and the goats into the other pen. Because the goats would antagonize and they would provoke. Remember them verses we just read? The goats would antagonize and they would provoke the sheep, especially the sheep who had been hurt and were wounded. And so you had to separate them out, which didn't sound like a big deal. Sheep, goat, right? Except for when you get to the babies. And Jesus said he's going to separate the indeed sheep out from the kids. Because what he was actually saying is, this rabbi told me, he said, what happens is, at night, whenever you're coming in and you're separating them out, a baby sheep and a baby goat look almost identical, and they sound exactly alike. And it's hard to figure out which is which. And what Jesus is saying is, in the church, you have to be careful, because there's people who sound like sheep and act like sheep and look like sheep, but they're really goats, because in their heart, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. In their heart, they're on the right-hand side of that list. They're really goats. And so Paul says we have to be careful. We have to be careful that we're not becoming a goat, that we're not provoking and wounding the sheep. Because goats, according to Paul, tend to think more of themselves than they should. He said, don't become conceited. Goats think more of themselves than they should. When I went on my mission trip to Guatemala, saw the craziest stuff down there. In the middle of this busy intersection, there is a guy on a stool milking a goat in the middle of the intersection. And cars just going around. Every now and then a car would stop and they would get out and they would purchase some milk from this guy in the middle of the intersection. And so we're walking along, we're standing there just watching this, taking pictures like, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. Until something crazier happened. When he got done, everybody there has a Toyota truck. I don't know why. It's just Toyota trucks everywhere. When he gets done, he opens up the door of the truck. Now listen, his children, he's got a truck bed full of children. His kids, his own children, are in the bed of the truck. When he gets done milking that goat, he opens up the door of that truck and the goat gets into the passenger side and sits there, and he gets in and they drive away. The goat is in the front seat. And his children are in the back of the truck. And that goat looks so proud. That goat just, look at me. That's right. And the goat thought, I got it going on. Look at me. Look at everything I've done. Look at the good stuff I did. I just gave milk. I just put some money in his pocket. Look how righteous I am. What the goat don't know is it's better to be the child of the farmer than the goat, because one day they're going to slaughter you and eat you. But the goat is so proud. Don't be a goat. Listen, we can all be goats sometimes. Be careful, Paul says. Don't get conceited. All of us can stumble and fall. What matters is, how do you treat somebody else when it happens to them? Because we're goats and we're just so proud. We're sitting up front. How long is that going to last? It's so much better to be the child. Galatians 6:3 says, if anyone thinks that you are something that you're not, you deceive yourself. And everybody needs to test your own actions. Then you can take pride in yourself alone without comparing yourself to somebody else. For each one should carry your own load. We can all be goats sometimes, Paul says. We all have we have this struggle between our spiritual nature and the flesh nature. But Paul says, examine yourself. Each one should test your own actions. Examine yourself and see which side of that list you're on. And what happens if I find out I'm on the wrong side of the list? Jesus not only washes your feet when you walk through this dirty world and you mess up and you get dusty. He wants to lift you up out of the dust and the dirt. Right after the Lord's Supper, right after he washed their feet when they were arguing over which one of them was the greatest. Right after he did all this, he led them out to a place called the Garden of Gethsemane, and it literally means the garden of the winepress, and it's located at the base of the Mount of Olives. And here's what he said, John 15, verse 1. Here's what he said when he got there. I am the true vine. He's looking around at the vineyard. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He's saying, I am the true vine. Not just any vine, not just one of the vines. I am the way. And then he comes to verse 2, and verse 2 sounds really messed up. Verse 2 says, he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. That sounds horrible. Listen, I'm trying to be a good Christian, and it says he's going to cut me off if I don't produce the right fruit. That's not what it says. When somebody messes up, that's what the flesh wants to do. We want to cut them off and we want to throw them in the fire, but that is not what Jesus said. The word is arrow, and it literally means to raise up, to elevate, to lift up, to remove and lift off of something else. It's translated in a lot of versions of the Bible as cut off, but it literally means to remove from or remove off of something else. Here's what one of the experts of Jewish history and Greek and Hebrew language says. This is a guy I quote all the time. I just like to say his name, Dr. Fruchtenbaum. Here's what Dr. Fruchtenbaum says. A vineyard in biblical times did not bear much resemblance to its modern counterpart. Vineyard back then did not look like a vineyard today. The vines grew upon the ground instead of being tied to some sort of support. Yet as long as the vine lays on the soil, it could not bear fruit. Therefore, the wine grower placed a rock underneath the vine to lift it off the ground, enabling it to be able to bear fruit. That's the point of this passage. The Greek word arrow in John 15:2, translated here as takes it away or cuts off, it can also mean to lift it up. And if the intent was to take it away, it would refer to a fruitless believer who is disciplined by death. However, the right translation, or the right way to understand that term, is to lift it up as is intended here. The Messiah lifts up every fruitless branch so that it can bear fruit. Every other time that phrase is used in the Bible, it is translated to lift up or to pick up or to be lifted up off of something else. It's the same word that is used in Matthew 4:6 that says, if you are the Son of God, Satan said, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, not cut you off, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Are you lifting people up? Or are you cutting them off? If you examine yourself like Paul said, and like, okay, listen, I got way too much stuff on the right-hand side of that list and the left-hand side. What do? Listen, God not only wants to dust your feet off, he wants to lift you up out of the dust in the first place, if you will let him. Ask him. You cannot produce fruit and bring people into the kingdom of heaven unless you are sharing the fruit of the Spirit instead of the fruit of the flesh. Back in Galatians 5:14, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. How do I treat somebody else when they have gotten their feet dirty? Do I call them out, throw stones at them? Or do I treat them the way that Jesus treated me whenever I did? Think about that thing that he was on his knees writing about you in the dust before you throw a stone at somebody else. We're going to have a communion service. Listen to the word communion. We want to be in communion with God, with Jesus Christ. We want to be walking with His Spirit. We've already talked about this. On the night that He was betrayed, he knelt down and He washed that guy's nasty feet. That's the kind of love He wants us to have for each other. Not just communion with Him, but communion with each other. And on the night that He was betrayed, He took that cup and He blessed it. And He said, "This is my blood. This is what's about to happen to me. So when you do this, from now on, you do it remembering me." And then later He took the bread and He broke the bread. And He said, "Listen, this is what's about to happen to me. And I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this instead of you. Do this in remembrance of me." That's all this table says. This do in remembrance of me. This does not say Shemuppa Community Church. Because this is not our table. This is the Lord's table. I don't know what your background is. I don't care. If you profess in your heart that Jesus is Lord, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, if you believe in your heart that God did in fact raise Him from the dead, the Bible says you will be saved. Period. Amen. You're welcome at this table. I'm going to ask the ones who are going to assist me today to come on up.